Thanks for tuning in to the first episode of our new podcast series, Founding Philosophies, the morals and life lessons of the Founding Fathers. This series, which is recorded in the George Washington Parlor at Fancy Hill, a very appropriate place, I may say, is dedicated to helping understand why, after 250 years, we should still be discussing and drawing inspiration from the men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and then, as today's program will talk about, Light Horse Harry Lee. A lot of people today might look and sort of criticize the founding generation for their moral shortcomings, their challenges and struggles, and perhaps even hypocrisy with institutions based in liberty but paralleled with that of slavery and with limited suffrage. I would counter that in addition to understanding these shortcomings, there's also a lot of value that we can learn from the founders, a lot of aspirational lessons to learn, and recognize that the founders, even though they lived 250 years ago, we need to remember that they're humans, and like us today, they were understanding and reasoning with and learning from the people before them. And I think it's important as we celebrate America's 250th anniversary that we try to learn a little more about the sort of moral underpinning that defined the founding generation, their views, what they liked, what they didn't like, and try to apply that to our life today. We live in a very tumultuous time, and I think the founding generation was much wiser than many of us, certainly wiser than I am, and the words that they wrote in various reminiscences and official publications and the Declaration of Independence, those are very inspirational texts that continue to guide and shape the leaders of our country. So thank you all for tuning into this program. We are excited to continue it throughout this 2026 year. And my first guest, I'm delighted to introduce. If you've been watching our recent programming, you'll see he spoke at our Founders Day program in Lexington, Virginia. We're recording this the following day. Ryan Cole, he's written 2 books on the Founding Fathers, one on Light Horse Harry Lee, who's the subject of today, and another on the Marquis de Lafayette and his return to America. Ryan's joining me to speak a little more about Light Horse Harry's sort of views on life, his guidance, the words he imparted on his children, famously Robert E. Lee, who never knew his father personally, but I think certainly would have learned a lot from his father's own writings and perhaps his father's shortcomings and aspirational goals. So, Ryan, do you want to just start by introducing yourself a little bit and maybe tell us what got you interested in Light Horse Harry to begin with? You obviously wrote a whole book on him, so it had to be something of devotion and attention.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks for having me on the show, and thanks for having me at Fancy Hill. It's a beautiful place. I was stunned when I drove up the driveway through the Poxwoods. Couldn't believe that I was going to be a guest here. So
yeah, well, we're happy to have you. And again, Fancy Hill is open by tours by appointment, so visit our website. We'll throw it up here for you to see. But I'm glad you've appreciated the house, and particularly hopefully this room as well, which, as you can see, the full room, it's very much dedicated to that founding generation.
I'm staring at Peele's portrait of George Washington right now, so it's a very appropriate setting for this conversation. And I always knew that there was a connection, obviously, between the Lee family and the founding of the country. Numerous Lees, cousins of Henry Lee III and Robert E. Lee's branch of the family. The Stratford Hall Lees, intimately involved in the founding and the creation of the country. Richard Henry Lee, Francis Lightfoot Lee, Arthur Lee. And so I always knew there was a connection there. And as I began to read a little bit more about it, I was fascinated. It was something that was in the back of my mind that obviously there's a contradiction, there's an incredibly dramatic contradiction between the fact that this family was involved in the founding of the country, and then a generation and a half later, the family was involved in the near destruction of the country, the severing of the country in two. And I thought, just as a matter of, I couldn't understand how that happened. So I thought, just getting out of the gate, I thought, what an interesting story. And I originally actually conceived, was there a way to write a book about both Robert E. Lee and Henry Lee III, tracking their involvement, one in the Revolution and one in the Civil War.
Yeah.
But then as I did more research and I read the existing biographies and books about Light Horse Harry Lee, I realized his life itself is a hugely, I think it's consequential. And then for the purposes of readers, fans of history, it's an incredibly dramatic life, tragic. I've said this a lot of times, but I love saying it, is that Hamilton's life made a incredibly popular musical. Light Horse Harry Lee's life would have made a tragic opera. It really is one of the most startling and surprising lives of any of the founding generation. So as I began to learn more about Light Horse, I realized I thought he deserved his own book, and I wanted to try to write it. So that's what drew me to it originally.
My story is much the same in learning about Light Horse. I obviously, being a student at Washington and Lee, knew a lot about Robert E. Lee, or at least should have known a lot. I myself did, but I really didn't know much about the father. I knew Light Horse Harry Lee's buried next to his son in Lee Chapel in the Lee family crypt. And, it calls him General Light Horse Lee. And I'd heard he was a Revolutionary War hero. And most famously, as you mentioned in your talk, the thing most people know about Lee, if they know it at all, is that he's the one that eulogized George Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. And so, that's not a huge legacy to leave, right? Father of a famous person and eulogized a famous person. But in gaining sort of some interest in Lee, I first picked up a book written in the 80s, I think by Charles Royster, on Lee, and read that. It was pretty interesting. I was most sort of amazed by his heavy involvement in the ratification of the Constitution in Virginia, the Virginia ratifying debates, and that he took on Patrick Henry, who of course was a critic of the Constitution and argued against adopting this new system of government. And so I thought, wow, what an important figure, and sort of overlooked in the Virginia history. And I don't know, I didn't grow up in Virginia, but I don't guess he's really talked about in the textbooks. And so why is that? Why is Light Horse Harry Lee sort of an obscure historical figure?
Great question. And Charles Royster's book is really one of the most enlightening, fascinating works on Lee. That's the first book I read. There's not that many biographies, but
yeah, definitely compared to Robert E. Lee, there's a new one every few
he
years.
Appears, Light Horse, one of the reasons I found him so interesting was he appears in some of the best works on Robert E. Lee. And his appearance is so startling that this tragic figure, this incredibly complex and in many ways noble, in many ways incredibly flawed father. So that again is one of the things that drew me to him. In terms of why he's not as well known, the trajectory of his life explains that in a lot of ways. But he had a life that had a number of incredible triumphs. You alluded to his participation in the Constitutional Convention in Richmond, where he clashed with Patrick Henry, who was his senior and who was silver-tongued, made compelling arguments, which are quite interesting to read in the transcripts of those debates. One in particular on behalf of giving the Congress the power to raise a standing army, which Henry feared be used against people, and that Lee, having fought in the Revolutionary War, had very little faith in militia. And he says to Henry, I fought in the war. I have the experience, which Henry didn't really have. Not quite the same. So that's really interesting. And then there's some very compelling arguments that they're interesting to look at that he makes during the Constitutional Convention about union, about that some of those who were participating in the Convention of Virginia were loath to form a new government with their northern brethren. And he says, after serving in the army, fighting alongside New Yorkers, Alexander Hamilton, for example, that he had a real sense of companionship with his countrymen, no matter where they were from. And he says famously, in all manners local, I'll be a Virginian, in other manners, I will be an American, which I think is, this is a long time before the Civil War, and making direct comparisons is tricky, but I think that's fascinating to hear the father, Robert E. Lee, say those things. And throughout his life, his trajectory of his life is really fascinating, and that participation in the ratification of the Constitution. Then his friends formed the first government. George Washington is his protege and good friend, and he grew up, on the Potomac, not far from Mount Vernon. His father, Henry Lee II, was a colleague of George Washington and a friend, and served with him in the House of Burgesses. And Washington would have been a fairly, a frequent guest at Lee, Sylvania, the Lee home in Prince William County. So he's got his friend George Washington as president. He is one of the chorus of voices that helps persuade or tries to, convince Washington to take the presidency.
Oh, really?
And then he also gives the oration in Alexandria upon Washington's departure for New York to take the presidency. So, and then his good friend Alexander Hamilton is going to guide the nation's finances. So it's a good time for him.
Yeah.
The trajectory, very typical of Lee, turns quickly. He's appalled by the idea of the government assuming the debts of the states. So he turns on the government, not on his friends, but he turns on the government, becomes disillusioned with the Constitution and new government, and starts to drift. And he has this project on the Great Falls of the Potomac where he thinks he buys land and then he's going to turn it into a city that's going to rise as the population moves westward and commerce is traveling along the now navigable Potomac. That doesn't work out because it's caught up in back taxes. So this is very typical of him, that a rise and then a dip, and his wife Matilda dies, a child, Nathaniel Greene Lee, dies, another son, Philip Ludwell Lee, dies. He ends up being elected governor of Virginia, but he's dealing with all this grief. So I could go on and trace the whole thing, but the eventual outcome is that his life is very different in its trajectory than Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Adams, is that it ends quite tragically. He bankrupts his family. He's thrown into debtor's prison. He's absent from his most amazingly, he's not home at Stratford Hall, the Lee ancestral home on the Potomac in Westmoreland County. He's not home when Robert's born. So he's a tragic life that ends very terribly. And I'm sure we'll probably get to that in the conversation, the particulars, but he ended, I just recently saw this, an obituary in a Southern newspaper after he died in 1818. Gallant spirit, farewell. The thorns which ingratitude had placed in thy path have ceased their vexation. So he lived a life that ended very sadly and tragically, and I think that's one of the reasons why he's not remembered. I think there's a lot of shame with the end of his life, the last years of his life, and because of that, he's not remembered in the same breath as our other founders, and he wasn't able to accomplish as much ultimately as them, wasn't able to rise to the levels in politics, though I think he thought he deserved to.
Well, let's talk about the ambition that he had. And you talked about this some in your Founders Day program, which again, I really encourage people to listen to on our YouTube page. But it seems to me from reading your book that Lee was very much one to want recognition, to want glory, and to want not just to have it thrown onto him without earning it, but to do something that was courageous, that deserved praise, and to sort of have that accommodation. And I recall, in the war, he has a very successful raid at Paulus Hook, which is a military fort, and it's very successful. It was tasked to him by Washington, but there's some sort of, you might call it inner politics, that caused some issues, and he actually gets court-martialed. It ends up, I understand, gets dropped, and it was sort of doesn't really associate too well with his legacy, but he was hoisted to some of the highest sort of fame in the Continental Congress, and then that he gets sort of pushed down from that pretty quickly. And again and again, he seems to be someone, he's not a general during the American Revolution. That's, I think, a big thing to note. He never gets that. He does eventually become a general after the war, but he seems like someone who's always striving to be at the top, but never quite reaches that. Is that fair to say that he wants the fame, he wants the glory? And I don't know, you might talk about the sort of what other options he had. I know there was considerations to go to France and fight in their revolution. So I mean, what's that life for him? The sort of the gaining glory. Nobody can gain it as much as maybe Washington, but he does seem to be trying to.
Yeah, he obviously. I've just written a book about Lafayette's return to America in 1824, 1825. Like Lafayette, Lee had canine appetite for fame and glory, and part of that, I think, was their education. You and I have talked about this before, studying classics, and they had notions of virtue and heroism, maybe typical of their classes at the time, and they pursued it in the American Revolution. Obviously, also there was an idealistic component for both of them.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Paul's hook, which was it's not just that Washington encouraged him, but Washington kind of gave him a lot of free rein to plan that raid after offering him entry into his personal circle of his administrative family, and Lee famously declined, saying, "I'm wedded to my sword."
Wow.
Right. Which would have been an opportunity that avails all sorts of opening of doors and connections. Being in Washington, it's that close into the orbit of Washington. But the Paul's Hook raid is successful, but it's a great symbolic of Lee's career in a lot of ways, because, as you mentioned, he's court-martialed for misstating the date of his commission to another officer. And he is, as you mentioned, he's not convicted, but so Congress, in kind of a conciliatory gesture, awards him a medal. It's the only medal awarded to a soldier in the Revolution below the rank of general. It's pretty significant.
Big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal. What's really interesting is that he never actually gets the medal. So I think it's for whatever reason, Congress forgets to add it to the list that's commissioned in France, and then Jefferson eventually, because Lee follows up on it after the war, it actually is struck, but then the die breaks, and Lee never actually gets it.
Yeah, well, that's almost some foreshadowing. This great medal that he earned, he never gets. Is sort of just out of the reach of him, right? This tragic.
It's wonderful, wonderfully symbolic, and he's trying to get it late in life, and then his son Henry Lee IV also, I think, is trying to find it too later, much later. So it's like there's symbolic about that reaching for glory, but also there's a brashness about Lee that rankles, upsets other soldiers. I mean, that I was kind of joking, but there's an army full of divas, of ambitious young men who were petulant about potentially of being usurped by others, and Lee was a kind of strutting, dashing figure who I think irritated some of his fellow soldiers and even some of his superiors. But over and over again, you see this kind of rhythm to his life where he rises he seems to be within the kind of fame and glory. And I think he felt as a soldier of the Revolution, and Royster's book has a lot of really great insights into this, is that his notion of service in the Revolution, he felt made him and his fellow soldiers more equipped to be in leadership positions to guide the country forward versus the population who felt some resentment towards during the worst parts of the Revolution, like 1780. So he saw himself as a leadership class, that he belonged to the leadership class. Obviously, some of that was realized as governor of Virginia, and then he's elected to Congress in 1799. I always like to say George Washington votes for him. George Washington actually, his day books mentions going to vote.
Oh, wow.
Vote for Lee for Congress. And when he gets to Congress, as you mentioned before, probably the pinnacle of his public life is giving the oration for Washington, which is very famous. A lot of people know Washington is first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. A lot of people can recite that, but not as many people know that Henry Lee III wrote those words. And also, I mentioned last night, I encourage watchers to read the whole thing. It's a really wonderful oration. It's, I think.
Well, we'll probably post it on our website.
That's great,
because that's a good piece. Well, I want to sort of hone in on something you mentioned of he read the classics. He studied ancient history, and I know we've been talking about this a little bit outside of this program. One of the remarkable things about Lee that I think people shared, and this you sort of start your book talking about this, is he was seen as a very brilliant scholar. He went to the College of New Jersey, had a number of distinguished classmates. One of his classmates was William Graham, who's the first rector, sort of president of what's now Washington and Lee. So well connected in the sort of, this early generation. Princeton's one of the few schools that are out there at this time to educate Americans. And so he has a formal education. He seems, I think, fair to say he's probably more book smart than either one of us, or even combined. I mean, he knows several languages. He knows about all these ancient Romans and Greeks, and he can just sort of recite their narratives as if he was, in Rome with them. But I think that's really interesting in how it sort of shaped his own view of military responsibility, and this sort of statesman thinking his service in the revolution somewhat qualified him to be a leader in the new country. I think that's very much a Roman sentiment, in that, you have in the many of the great consuls and leaders of the Roman Republic are themselves military veterans, and that's just about the easiest way. You most famously will think of Caesar and Augustus. Those people served with quite good distinction in the Roman military, and then rose up to take over. So I mean, how heavy do you think his admiration for the sort of the Roman era, the classical period, is influencing his own life's views and outlooks?
There's a letter that Hamilton wrote during the war praising Lee to another soldier, but saying that he would be better off if he had a little less Caesar in him. So I think he had a huge first. I'm going to tell a little story that drives home the point of his brilliance.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll get a little bit off of the subject from your question, but in my book about Lafayette, my research, I came across a diary written by a young Virginian named Jonathan Ambler, who was traveling in France in 1824, and he met Lafayette. If you were an American and you came to France and Lafayette was in Paris, you would seek him out, or you'd go to LaGrange, where no American was a stranger to Lafayette. And this young man meets Lafayette, and actually at the home of Francis Wright, the Scottish author, reformer, who's Lafayette's protege in Paris, and Ambler gets an audience with Lafayette, and Lafayette says Lafayette is excited to be around a young American, especially Virginia. Has him sit down next to him, and first he tells him a really wonderful story that drives home Lee's kind of presence, that when Washington was having each of his officers swear allegiance to the United States and renounce any allegiance to King George III and his heirs, when he came to Lee jokingly wouldn't, kept putting his hand up and approaching the Bible, and then he wouldn't, and when he backed away, and then eventually Washington said, what's the reason for this conduct? And Lee says, well, I hate King George III, he's a tyrant, but I don't really know about the Prince Regent, he may be an okay guy, and everyone laughed. But in Ambler's diary, he also mentions that Lafayette asks him, he says, hey, do you speak any French? And Ambler didn't speak any French, and he says, no. And Lafayette says, well, when I got to America, I was in the same predicament in terms of I didn't really speak any English. He was learning English on the boat over. And he says, there was only one other officer I remember who could speak French. It was Light Horse Harry Lee. So he was brilliant. He knew many languages. In fact, we've talked about his day book, which he kept when he was in exile, which we can talk about a lot out of context. At the end of his life, there's all sorts of languages. There's passages written in numerous languages. So he's a brilliant man. Also, the day book is a wonderful example of this. It's full of, and he was reciting this, obviously. I think he traveled with some books with him because he had a trunk he carried with him, but he was reciting passages from classics. If you look at it, every other page has some quotation from Greek or Roman literature. Yeah. So it was incredibly, he learned that his whole life. It wasn't just at the College of New Jersey. I think he studied his whole life, was captivated by that, and translated into his political outlook. And then, tellingly, he, in letters which you have seen, and also in his journal or diary, day book, continually was kind of encouraging his children, his sons, to read the same, and not only just emulate George Washington, but read classics, right? Yeah. So it was a huge part of who he was and informed his outlook in life.
Well, and I think it's really important to note that for us, we often look back to the wise words of Thomas Jefferson or, George Washington, even more recent, MLK, people that are historical figures in our life, especially, my generation, and they're typically Americans, they're removed enough from us. But for the Founding Fathers, they're reading the works that express sentiments of liberty. They're reading Locke. They're reading a lot of these sort of more recent philosophies that encourage the concept of what will eventually become sort of this democratic republic. But really, the best example they have to go back to is this sort of Athenian democracy period, right? And this is why people call it the Western civilizations. And, we pivot so much of our emphasis on this era of, it was 2,400 years ago in Athens. But there's a lot of inspiration for his own cause of liberty, his own, in the trying days of the early republic, when, we're wondering if now that George Washington has passed on, is this process that we fought for, that people died for, is it going to continue? And I think Lee is very wise in that he knows, well, it worked for people, back in the Greek times, right? I mean, he can give an example. He can look at a concrete period and say, well, it worked for them. Can it work for us? And also look just as wisely and say, well, this is what didn't work for these people, right? And sort of use that as precautions. I think he's a very, he's very historically grounded. And if anybody ever asks, why study history today, if nothing else, it just gives you some great examples of how societies rise and how they fall, and maybe helps guide you in your own. So I think, his historical inquiries really do help. And I think that's a common sentiment among a lot of the great founders that we talk about.
Yeah, and I also think he's really useful. I mean, thinking a lot about where we are now we're in the 250th of the Revolution, and we're about to hit the 250th of the Declaration, and kind of what we can pull from these stories. And he was obsessed with virtue. You read his diary, flipping through it, and almost every other page is a lesson on classical virtues. But he wasn't an entirely virtuous person himself, right? And he, as I alluded to, he speculated in the land wildly without a lot of care or skill, and he bankrupted his family, and he spent time in debtor's prison, which incredibly wrote really one of the best early memoirs of the Revolution, particularly the Southern campaign. And then he ends up, after being in a noble act, he ends up defending a friend who was a printer in Baltimore. He's beaten by a mob. His health is in such terrible shape, and his creditors are still hounding him, that he leaves his family behind and ends up wandering around the West Indies 5 years at the end of his life, taking advantage of strangers and swindling an old widow to get, when he decides to come back to America, to pay off his debt. So there's a lot of qualities of this man that are, it's another conversation about whether, I think he made bad decisions and he was forced to make even worse decisions. And I was intent, not trying to make excuses, but it was, not less criminal intent than carelessness that led to criminal intent. So he was a complicated person who had a lot of really great, noble values. His battlefield genius, one of the most eloquent early Americans, service to the country, his participation in making the case for the Constitution. We also mentioned his leading of the Federal Army into Western Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion. Did a lot of, which was something he felt unease about doing, about using federal power in that way. But Hamilton and Washington and Lee felt it was a first real legitimate threat by the people against the federal government. He participated in a lot of really important things, but he also had a lot of character flaws. I mean, I talked about last night. It's an incredible story that right shortly before he ends up going to debtor's prison, that a man who he owed money to, was allowed into Stratford Hall, his home, and took some, I think, silverware, took some of the Lees, or furniture, belongings of the Lees as compensation. And when Lighthorse found out about that, he stormed onto his property, tore down his fences, ran into his house, stole silverware, ham, liquor, and then gored an ox on his way out. Wow. So that's an amusing, wild story, but it's complicated. It's a complicated person with good qualities and bad qualities, and I think we should be able to look at, he's just one of many. Obviously, this is more probably germane to Washington and Jefferson. You alluded to that some of their values do not match our own values. And that's good, that we can see that, but we've kind of passed through a period where we confuse contextualizing, being able to see that even our heroes have flaws, but we've confused that with just saying, tearing these people down. Lee's a great example. I think he is a noble person, an important person, but also he's interesting to study because he's got a lot of qualities that aren't so noble. If we don't celebrate our countrymen from history because we seek out all their flaws, then we won't have anyone to celebrate because we're all flawed. You're flawed, I'm flawed. Great people are flawed, not just our founders. And so Lee's a great test case for that, I think.
So there's two points to that are really interesting, and I think have a lot of takeaways to today. Is one, his view on monuments, physical monuments. I would think that Light Horse Lee would be a great defender of monuments not getting torn down and putting monuments up. And actually, you might be able to talk about some of the specific ones, but I'm pretty sure he was highly supportive of a memorial to George Washington. Really wanted to memorialize the just founding generation and make it sort of a public initiative, right? Not just he himself liked it, but he wanted the government to support these things and erect monuments to the memories of this. And I think, that's important to a nation. And we have in DC today so many monuments among a pretty broad array beyond the founding generation. But, could you speak a little more on the monuments of our founders?
Yeah, happily. And his depth of despair when he was governor of Virginia, 1792, 1793, he actually conceived of an idea to going to fight in the French army against Austria in the middle of the French Revolution. And he writes to Lafayette in pursuit of a commission. And Lafayette at that point had fled the country and was shortly after arrested by Austrian authorities. But he ends up, actually, there's someone else in France who he conceives he can write to and get the commission. And then it falls to Washington, of course, to convince him, politely, in a wonderful letter that Washington wrote. I quoted in my book saying, not much I can say about it. I'm not going to, that's how Washington says, really not much I can say about it, but I will tell you that how might it look for the chief executive of one of America's largest states to go fight in another country's war?
Yeah.
So then Lee ends up saying, it was madness after all. So I think it's an interesting thing. You make a great point. I mean, obviously, one of Lee's legacies is his oration and his tributes, not just the eulogy for George Washington. He delivered a farewell speech for George Washington when he left Alexandria to assume the presidency. I think I mentioned that before. He gave a wonderful eulogy for Patrick Henry, his one-time rival during the Constitutional Convention in Richmond. So those are monuments with words, right? The whole point of them is the same thing as monuments, to instruct future generations to look upon the example of a Henry or a Washington. Now, his one term in Congress, one really notable thing is that he leads the effort to have federal funds appropriated to build a monument, an early incarnation of a monument to Washington. And he is engaged in a very fascinating back and forth debate with Nathaniel Macon, who was kind of like, I always say, like, that generation's Ron Paul, Dr. No against any federal spending, any federal project. In fact, when Lafayette comes back to America, Congress eventually ends up appropriating him $200,000 as a compensation for his service in the Revolution. Of course, Macon votes against it on principle. So they have this wonderful debate. And it's not just about money, actually. It's because there's a sense that political winds are turning, right? That Jeffersonians are assuming power and the Federalists are eventually on their slide away from power. And the idea of creating a monument to Washington was politically uncomfortable for some of the Democratic Republicans. So that's some of the context of this debate. But Lee's arguments, which you can go look at the record, this congressional record, or you can read my book, are wonderful. They're wonderful. They're stirring in the sense that he is saying that future generations have to have something to look to, right, as an example. And that we were just talking about that. We can now say, well, Washington obviously was a flawed person, but his monument, the monument there is to an ideal. You and I, when I came into this house yesterday, we were talking about Lee, and I mentioned that someone who had incredible focus on virtues, but wasn't always virtuous himself. And you said, well, it's aspirational. And I think those monuments are important because they allow us to focus on really good things. Our founders had really great qualities. We're living the lives that we have now because of those qualities. And even though there are still problems in our country that I always say the revolution is ongoing, but their genius created the conditions that allow us to remedy those problems. And that's why I think monuments are hugely important. And Lafayette, when Lafayette came to America, an interesting kind of postscript to this. So what happens is that Lee ends up carrying the day in Congress, but the Washington Monument that is on the mall today. That's a different monument than the one that was conceived at the end of the 18th century. But Lee does carry the day, and like I said, his argument's very compelling. Still makes a lot of sense. That, he's thinking very much into the future. Like generations like us would someday walk along in the national capitol and see a monument to George Washington, and it would inspire us to do better, right? To try and emulate his good qualities. But there isn't really a boom in any type of memorials to the revolutionary generation in the early republic, partly because there's not the industrial capacity. So I always say the country's busy building. It's economically and moving, spreading westward. It's not spending a ton of time on its looking backwards until we get closer to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. When Lafayette comes to America in 1824, there's already kind of in the years leading up to this, there's a revival of interest in the revolutionary history, which is seen by engravings of the Declaration or histories of the era. Hezekiah Niles, the Baltimore-based publisher, publishes a book of speeches from the era. So there's this real boom in interest in the era that develops, and Lafayette's reappearance sets it into just like a frenzy. It's a frenzy about him, but it's also about the revolutionary generation. And that then triggers a kind of an interest in building monuments. There's already one under construction in Baltimore to George Washington, but when Lafayette goes into the South in particular, he presides over the dedication or the cornerstone laying of monuments to DeKalb and Camden, and then Greene and Pulaski and Savannah. And the reason is because the people in those communities see this, number one, this is the time to do it. They're able to raise money. There's interest in it because of Lafayette and this interest in the revolution. And then if you have Lafayette presiding over it, it's the nation's guest at the time. It's such a huge thing. But I was looking, as I was doing research on the book, I was looking at the type of language when some of these committees in those towns tried to raise money and put out flyers or circulars trying to raise money, and they were making the case. And also the oration at the ceremony, both from Lafayette and so often they were Masonic ceremonies, as a lot of the events that had a Masonic character in Lafayette's tour. The language is fascinating because it echoes the same argument Lee was making when he was arguing for a monument to Washington, that we need to have some type of something for future generations to look to and try and emulate in whatever way possible the sacrifices of these people. In the case of DeKalb, who died, another European who came to America and fight for, he'd actually been to America previously, unlike Lafayette, but who came to fight for another people and died.
Well, and I think you can expand the sentiment that Lee expresses to later generations in America, and particularly after the Civil War, this thought that when Lafayette comes, and of course Henry Lee's dead by the time Lafayette comes to America, dies, I guess, 6 years before, but by the time Lafayette comes, he's one of the last of that generation, right? All of the veterans from the Revolution are either in the grave or, old
headed
white
there.
hair, and right. I mean, it's the end of this era, and so people are concerned. The remaining veterans themselves very concerned of, hey, these are my comrades, my colleagues, and I think for Lee, he was particularly mindful of that after his great friend Nathaniel Greene died suddenly, just a couple years after the Revolution, and then also when Washington died in 1799, also unexpectedly. I think Lee really mourned the loss of two very close people to him, and he wanted people to be able to remember them as he did. And I think Lafayette had quite the same sentiments with all of the great friends he'd made and heroes that he'd met in America during the Revolution. And so there seems to be something of a generational effort that I also see in America in the sort of turn of the century into the 20th century and into the first couple decades, where you get a huge surge of Confederate memorials and as well as Union memorials. And often this gets into a debate of, are they Jim Crow era monuments put up to oppress certain classes of people? And there's an argument to be had there. But I think the real key characteristic, if you really talk and read, if you read the conversations that generation is having, these aged veterans of the Civil War, they're wanting to put up monuments because this is somebody that they admired so greatly, that they knew personally, that inspired them, that inspired their comrades. People are worried that the legacy, the memory of those people are fading, right? I mean, when that generation passes on, who will carry the torch and talk about them? So I think that's a very Lee's sort of views, Henry Lee's views on monuments and memorials really resonates with a later generation of Americans, a couple generations or more removed. And I think you also see those trends sort of with today increasingly with the wars of the 20th century, that now people, want to memorialize and talk more about. I see a lot of, Facebook reels and other clips of World War II veterans telling their stories. And there seems to be a real surge of interest in that because, of course, that generation is fading away. And so, there really is a sort of timeless attribute to this memorialization and why it means so much to especially veterans.
You actually thank you, because you reminded me of something, is that when Lee was in the Continental Congress, he advocated for a memorial to Nathaniel Greene shortly after his death. And I just made the connection, and Lafayette ends up presiding over the cornerstone laying of a not obviously not the same memorial that Lee conceived, but a memorial to Greene in Savannah in 1825. So it's an interesting connection there. But you said something I think is great and powerful in terms of these debates we've had about memorials. Rather than tear down memorials, we should build new ones. I think that's if I always say this about memorials, that if you're in a community and the memorial is in that community and the person is completely at odds with the values of the people in that community, then it's not for me to judge if they decide they don't want that memorial there. I'm not a taxpayer in their community, so I don't have any say. Yeah. But I think ideally we would have a dynamic where you could kind of contextualize and explain if there's problematic qualities of the people who we built memorials to, and then instead of tearing them down, provide that context and then build new memorials to people whose values more perfectly reflect our own in the 21st century. That's the solution, not to tear down art, but to build more art, right? To commission more art and commission. I think Washington and Lee would be pleased by that, commissioning more monuments to more people, civil rights leaders, people involved in expansion of rights and participation of women in our country.
Well, and years. I think even, people from the Revolution going way back that have been overlooked, the ones who there's not volumes and volumes of books on, who we think, hey, this person actually made a meaningful contribution. So you've got me sold. More monuments. If you're watching, make a donation.
Make more monuments, and the monuments. Even you're right. There were men and women who participated in the Revolution who were of contributions from Black Americans, from Jewish Americans, from a very diverse group of people who helped found this country, and that could be reflected in increasing number of monuments, not tearing down the ones that we have. I think, and I think in the process we cultivate a new generation of, ideally, of the arts and literacy. So I think that's the solution. And you even said, I thought interestingly, if you have institutions whose names are problematic, don't subtract a name, add another name, right? That can help better make an institution better reflect our values today. And I was cautionary about it because, in a century, our own values will probably not be sufficiently enlightened. So be careful. It's a slippery slope. But I think there's a way to address concerns, difficulties with historical figures. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to destroy them, but to make their complexity better understood, and then at the same time celebrate additional historical figures, I think is the solution. Yeah. And I'd like to think some of our founders who had such enthusiasm for building monuments would support that.
Yeah, and I think I want to, and for sake of time, sort of pivot to this end of life for Henry Lee. You mentioned he was in exile. He went to Barbados and some other places in the West Indies to sort of two ways. One, to sort of escape the debtors that were still looking for payments. But I think the really big reason too is his health. His health had deteriorated so bad because of that mob that really gruesomely assaulted him during the War of 1812 in Baltimore. And so he spends the last 5-6 years of his life in the West Indies in a pretty miserable state. And if you read the letters, they're actually in this book, which we'll be taking scans of and publishing. This is Lee's Henry Lee's memoir of the War of the Southern Department, his sort of memoirs of his time in the Revolution.
Written while he was in prison.
Written while he was in prison. And then this version is Robert E. Lee's second edition of it that he published in 1870, just a few months before his death. And he adds a preface to it talking about his father some, who of course he never really knew. But the really interesting thing in it is all these letters that he includes that Lee's half-brother Charles Carter Lee had kept from Henry Lee, who in exile is writing advice to his kids. It's really, at this point, the only thing he can leave them is advice.
Yeah,
right? He can't
right.
leave them a fortune. He can't leave them their family home. He can't leave them anything other than wise words of wisdom. And so that book is filled with exceptional advice that really, I think, even today would serve students, young people, older people even very well to read and appreciate. But he writes heavily on all number of topics in all number of languages. And one of the things that strikes me most, and we put it on the mug that is in front of you, and as well as a sticker that we have on our website, is how he views education and the sort of value of education. And so I want to talk about that, and then you can maybe share some other moral advice he leaves. But one of the things he says is that you should, and I'll quote from the mug, that you should read, therefore, the best poets, orators, and historians, as from them you glean moral truths and axioms. And it's sort of a much longer quote. His sentences are very lengthy. But, you know, he encourages to read the people that he gives lists of people that he says, you know, Locke is okay. You know, I think some of this other person's better, but Locke's good. And then he lists the ones he doesn't recommend. He's a very critical reader. But he gives, you know, he sort of draws from a wide array, what you might even call sort of a liberal arts curriculum. You know, this sort of predates that concept, but, you know, he wants you to be good at math and be good at philosophy and you know, understand practical sciences, which was a big sort of Washington push. He himself tried it unsuccessfully. So, you know, he sort of encouraged, much like his son would as president of Washington College, very practical education that made people talented in all number of exploits. And I think Henry Lee's a great example where he tried his hand at all number of exploits, and some with more success than others. But I think he really envisioned an educational future where people could do a lot of things and not just be set to the one task that they study or that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm thinking about his various career endeavors with very differing degrees of success. Attempted to be a farmer, was an author, was a historian, politician. That was in the family calling, right? He was a soldier above all else. He did try and live a life of a very varied life inspired by what we would call classical arts education. I was just thinking, he was also a fantastic propagandist. Obviously, politically, he was an opponent of Jefferson. Hated Jefferson. Jefferson hated him. And he wrote this wild pamphlet about Jefferson during his presidency, where he attacks the Louisiana Purchase, and then he describes Monticello as, I wish I had it in front of me, but a disgusting mansion on a crag of a mountain. So he was, did a lot of things with skill. But you alluded to probably the most astonishing part of Lee's life, which leads up to him being to the point where he could only offer his sons advice through letters, was that I mentioned before, he defended a friend who was a Federalist newspaper publisher in Baltimore who would publishing editorials highly critical of the administration, or the Madison administration's prosecution of the War of 1812, which Lee opposed just vehemently.
Yeah, which is interesting as a,
He was completely against it, and he rails against it in his diary, although he, if asked to serve in it, he obviously would have. He goes to Baltimore to defend Alexander Hanson, is the man's name, the publisher, defend him, and they hole up in a house, and a mob forms outside, and eventually the publisher and Lee and their little band are taken for protection to a jail. The mob follows them there, breaks into the jail, and beats them, and Lee is slashed in the face. They attempt to cut off his nose, in it pouring candle wax into his eye sockets. So he's described afterwards as completely covered in blood and
very unsightly.
Unsightly and tottering like a baby, unable to speak. So his health is destroyed, and he's a broken man. There's a wonderful vignette of a young woman who remembers seeing him at church and at Christ Church in Alexandria, and describing basically he looks like a monster. That's the this was the men still stopped to take their hats off to the old hero of the revolution, but he's so disfigured that he's scaring children in church. So he seeks, you're right, to escape from people he owed money to, but also he's convinced that a warmer climate will help him recover his health, which it does not. His health is failing, and he ends up, those letters are written. He has no money. Like I said, he has to swindle people to continue to exist for 5 years. He's a vagrant, basically.
Yeah.
And it's very sad because he's got this family back in Alexandria, and the only thing he can do is send them coconuts or coffee or pineapples or whale bones. But as you alluded to, he still tries to instruct, even as an absentee father, and the advice he gives is very useful in terms, read history, emulate George Washington. And those are still, to this day, very useful. And it's obviously, this story ends tragically. He decides he wants to come back to America in 1818 and come back and see his family. But as I think I said before, he only is able to get passage on a ship by having a widow who had taken care of him, pay off his debts, and then he gave her a check, bank in Savannah, that as compensation that he actually never even owned, had any money in. And as they're coming up along the coast of Georgia, he realizes off of Cumberland Island is where Nathaniel Greene's daughter, Louisa Shaw, lives in Dungeness. And he's asked to be let off because I think he's conceiving he's going to go die in the home of his old general.
Which he does.
Yeah. And is buried there too, and doesn't come back. Is actually exhumed and brought back to Virginia and is here, down the road, right, in 1913. That's where the story ends. But there's an interesting postscript that is obviously very relevant to Washington Lee, is that this journal that we've talked about is here, right, the library at Washington Lee.
Yeah.
And it only gets here because a soldier of the Confederacy, his father, for some reason happened to be in Georgia, and after Lee dies, took possession of Lee's trunk, that is last remaining.
All his possessions,
possessions, including the journal. And then in the middle of the Civil War, I think it's 1864, the soldier sends the diary to Robert E. Lee with a note, which is here at Washington Lee, explaining that my father had this for years and it's belonged to your father. And so I always thought it was wonderful. If Robert E. Lee looked at it, he would have seen his name, and he would have seen those instructions that you were talking about here's what you should read. I think he said don't read Shakespeare, right?
Yeah, he was not a huge fan.
Not a huge fan. But so ultimately, in the day, I wondered what it must have felt like for Robert E. Lee to hold this, also in the middle of the Civil War, his father's diary at this terrible point of his life, and see his own name and see his own instructions that he left behind. That's his own, the legacy he left to his children was, this scribblings in this diary.
And I think Alan Gelzo's book on Lee, the sort of most recent biography, came out maybe in 2022, sort of makes a big point of how Lee's father issues, basically, his absence of a father figure in his life really led him to try to emulate George Washington, which is, of course, a great proxy father. Lafayette calls Washington his father, and and that the sort of saying that Robert E. Lee had to move on from Henry Lee, basically. He just was he was never in his life. It was never somebody he could look to. And because of that, Robert E. Lee, as you mentioned in your talk yesterday, really had to, he was very different from his father in many ways. He avoided debts. He's very cautious, and even his military tactics, there's a lot of differences. But I think it's really touching to me in reading the letters that Henry writes in exile. He's writing almost all of them to Charles Carter, but every letter just about mentions Robert, who this boy that he hardly knows.
Yeah.
And how is Robert doing? I hope he is of, good spirit, and, he was always a sickly boy, but I hope he, grows up into a strong man. I mean, he hopes for Robert E. Lee. And of course, he'll never know what happens to Lee. He never sees Robert E. Lee. He never learns about Robert E. Lee's military career, Henry Lee is a troubled figure, a tragic figure. You've called him many times here. But I think there's a lot of value to come from him and a lot of wisdom. He was incredibly intelligent. He was incredibly witty. And I think though he was imperfect, he really is a founding father that I think America can look to in this period, this 250th anniversary, and recognize the imperfect status that they left, but this aspirational, this hope for a better future. And I would encourage people watching this to learn a little bit more about Henry Lee, because he is one of the most exciting characters you'll read. And when you read Ryan's book, you'll really be pulled into that life, those ups and downs, as if you're right there along with him. So he's a great founding father, a great person, I think, to launch this podcast episode in. Ryan, do you have any departing remarks you'd like to leave with our viewers?
No, I think Lee died in 1818, and he didn't. You said, well, he didn't get to see what became of his son, which is a fascinating question, because obviously his son is offered the possibility to play a role in ending the rebellion.
Yeah, to command the Union Army at the start of the war.
Right. So what his trajectory historically is, if that happens, or if the Civil War ends differently, it's interesting to see what he imagined for himself, what Henry Lee imagined for himself, his son could have grasped that type of role in history. That's fascinating. But so he died in 1818 after being away from America for 5 years. So in a sense, he never really got to see what became of the country he helped found. But what's interesting is Lafayette arrives in 1824, and I don't know if I even mentioned this, but Lafayette and Lee were friends, and Lee hung up a portrait of Lafayette at Stratford Hall, and they corresponded during the war. And Lafayette made a point of stopping at the Lee House in 1824 and visiting with Lee's widow, and it's likely Robert marched in some of the processions that brought Lafayette into Alexandria. But what I wanted to say was that Lafayette, after being gone 40 years from America, his last visit was in 1784, got to come back and see what had become of that project in liberty. Both Lee and he had helped, and was amazed by the progress he saw, material progress, the profusion of the arts and institutions, civil societies, we would call it. And he was able to say in letters writing home to fellow French veterans of the Revolution, you can't imagine the progress made possible here by representative government. It surpasses my imagination. So the trajectory of the country that Lee didn't get to see is quite remarkable. And obviously now, 200 years later from Lafayette's visit, that's only, grown and grown. But the one thing I would say, I think it's useful because we've talked a lot about complexities here and having a fulsome account of the country's history. Lafayette also was able to point out areas such as slavery, racism, that he thought there was still work left to be done in the Revolution, and politely encourage Americans to continue that great work. And they have the tools, as our history has shown since then, because of the Revolution, because of the founders. They gave us the means to get closer and closer to a perfect union. And I think that's a wonderful way to look at our history as we celebrate the 250th of the country and the Revolution.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, it's the abolitionists that were successful in ending slavery, the ones that really made change, were the ones that embraced the founding philosophies. People like Frederick Douglass embraced the words of the Declaration of Independence and the virtues that represented the aspirational intent that document expressed. So,
and King too, right? Martin Luther King Jr. saw the Declaration as a promissory note.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So the founders, even though it's 250 years ago, their words, their wisdom is just as relevant today. And we really need to hit that home this year. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for helping us celebrate our revolutionary founders. And Ryan, thanks for joining me on this podcast. I hope when you write your next book, maybe I can have you on again. Thanks for watching. Go Generals, and have a great rest of your day.